So our next speaker hardly needs an introduction, so I'll hardly give him one. His name is Kuhn. He was the longtime general manager for the Colorado River District. He's well known to many, and now he is an author.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Andy, and thank you, River District staff. I want to say thank you for the board of directors. You made a great decision in finding a replacement. Andy, really impressed with the video and with the energy and the enthusiasm. And it's really good to know that snow surveys and stream flow surveys and snow surveys are a big part of the River District culture, that we started a long time ago. Actually, I succeeded some who started that, I would say, many, many years ago. So I want to talk a little bit about, since I've left the district, I haven't really left the basin. And during my tenure at the district, long before I was the manager, I got interested in the history. How did we use the information that was presented to us? And specifically about the hydrology. And those people who know me know I'm a little more hung up on numbers than language. And so I speak in numbers, and that's difficult at times. But what I found was, let's look at the hydrology of the river. What did we know? When did we know it? And more importantly, how did we use it? And there's some interesting myths out there, and there's some interesting stories. And it's really, I think what you're going to see is when the book comes out, it's really quite relevant. The history is quite relevant to our future. So the book that I worked with John Fleck, when I decided I needed to, or I would like to do a book, I needed somebody who could translate my board memos and things like that, the style I had developed over these years, into something that people would read. John was he's already had a very good book on the Colorado River out, so it was a good partnership. Now, let me just say that one of the things that I wanted to explore was this idea of what were the compact negotiators, what did they think they were doing, and what information did they base it on? And we came up with some really interesting results, and I think they've been out there. Others have spoken about them. This isn't new stuff. I think this is just collecting it and putting it in one spot. The first thing we realized was there was no general consensus in 1920 as to what the river was producing. The second is that all of this was new. So we're not very critical of what the compact negotiators did, because they were doing something that was brand new. They were dividing up a river. They really didn't understand what we now call natural flow or virgin flow. They didn't even use that concept. They started to think about it during the later phases of the compact negotiations. But going into the compact negotiations, that was not a term that was commonly used, even by the hydrologists of the time. Another point is there were some very big experts on the river, and largely because of the way they handled themselves and the way they communicated, they were largely excluded from the discussion of the future of the river. One of those was a man named E.C. LaRue, who was an engineer who worked for the USGS. And you got to remember, the USGS and the Bureau of Reclamation were married until 1907. The Bureau of Reclamation, the Reclamation Service until 1923, actually was a part of the USGS. When the agencies split, the idea was the USGS would be the science agency, provide the data, provide the technical information, and the Bureau Reclamation Service would be the on-the-ground implementing it. They would be the ones, the engineers that built the canals, the dams, the reservoirs, and they did those kinds of things. Initially, that split didn't work well because a lot of folks who wanted, especially who were left behind in USGS, were interested in the policy, interested in water development, and a lot of the Bureau of Reclamation folks were also interested in the science. So that split that began over 100 years ago didn't really get off to a great start. But at the same time, they had really talented people at the time that did some really innovative things. Now, one of the things, there was two perspectives. E.C. LaRue and, let me see, E.C. LaRue was known for his view that the Colorado River wasn't going to provide enough water in the future to meet all projected needs. The alternative, and I'll go into this pretty quickly, and so 6 years before the compact came out, he came to the conclusion that the flow of the river was insufficient to meet future needs. Now, a contrast to that was Arthur Powell Davis, who was the nephew of John Wesley Powell, and he was the director of the Reclamation Service. First he was chief engineer, then he was the director. He was, a lot of people hear about Carpenter and Hoover. He was probably as influential in the early development of the river as any one person, including how the compact was ultimately structured. Davis Dam is named after Arthur Powell Davis. He left, he would rather have not, he was fired, quite frankly, in 1923. And basically for being too much of an engineer and not being enough of a bureaucrat. But what basically Powell said was that he believed that with sufficient, proper and sufficient conservation, and the meaning of conservation in 1923 was build dams, hold the water, so you could use it when you needed it. That was, quote, conservation. That's the conservation in the Colorado River Water Conservation District. So the conservation term has evolved. But Powell basically thought that with sufficient conservation, sufficient storage, there was enough water to meet essentially all of the lands that could be favorably reached. Now, where he and the states didn't agree is what was meant by development of the lands that could be favorably reached. Davis took a very narrow view of it in terms of you needed to have the right soils, you needed to have a decent growing season, you needed to basically, you couldn't pump it for thousands of feet up. It had to be a relatively economic project. Now, some of the especially the upper basin states basically saw, if there was land, it could be irrigated. It didn't care, 10,000 feet, just a minor detail. So there was a big difference between Powell and the states over what lands could be favorably reached. That began a trend about demands, the upper basin states, especially the upper division states of the upper division, overstating their demands. That really began in 1922, and it's really continued really through today. And I'll go into that, and I'll second what Brad said here in a second. So you had these conflicting views. Davis put out a report along with, was called the Fall Davis Report, and actually it was the Bureau of Reclamation Engineers that primarily wrote this with help from, input from USGS. The Fall Davis Report is sort of the defining document on the Colorado River in the early 1920s. Congress authorized the report to look at the problems of the Imperial Valley. The flooding problems, the fact that they were, to get their water, the canal ran into Mexico and then back into the U.S., and that they had to provide half of the water to Mexico. That's what their predecessors had agreed to when they got their permits from New Mexico, was that Mexican farmers could have access to half the water. It was completely legal. It was something that was supported by the State Department, but it was a private development company that did that. So when they didn't like that for several reasons. First was water quality coming back in wasn't all that great, and two, they didn't have a whole lot of control over their water supply with Mexican farmers, and they really weren't Mexican farmers. They were U.S. landowners who were farming in Mexico, and that's still the same situation we have today. So it was a little bit complicated, but the bottom line is, why do we have a, quote, all-American canal? Is they wanted a canal that would go on all-American ground so they wouldn't have to share a water supply with Mexico. But nonetheless, this report was authorized by Congress to study that. They studied that, and then they said, and the vicinity. Well, lucky for us, the Bureau of the Reclamation Service's definition of vicinity was everything in the basin, and perhaps even a few things outside the basin, like the Front Range and the Southern California Coastal Plain. Now, By the time this report was published, there were trans-mountain diversions in here to the Front Range for municipal uses, for irrigation uses. There were out-of-basin diversions to the Southern California coastal plain, what ultimately became MWD's pipeline. So this report was actually pretty good for a 1920s in terms of what it was developing. But what record did they have? Well, there's no gauge at Lee Ferry till 1922. There were very limited gauges in the basin really up until 1930. 1929, the Boulder Canyon Project Act passed. It directed the Bureau of Reclamation to do, by then it was the Bureau, to do a comprehensive study. They gave them a bunch of money, and they invested. One of the first things they did is invest that money in a bunch of new gauges. So prior to 1929, most of the record you see today is synthesized. It's made up from a handful of gauges. The Bureau of Reclamation's quote record that starts in 1906, others go back to even before that, as we shall see. It's largely synthetic hydrology before 1922 from a handful of gauges that they use to estimate the flow of the river. Now, one of the stories that you hear is that, well, the commissioners were burdened by the fact that they only had data that began about 1900. That's true. The first gauge at Yuma was 1902. First gauges in the upper basin ranged from 1895 to about 1915. And it was an extremely wet period. That's partially true, partially not true. The wet period began about 1905, 1906, and lasted to about 1930. And that was an extremely wet period. It's probably one of the wettest 2 or 3 periods in the last 1,400 years. And that's something we've known really since the 1930s. But what they didn't do, what the USGS, LaRue and some others wanted them to do was go back and look at what was happening from the 1870s and on. Now, we didn't have specific gauge data. We actually had some river stage readings. We had lots of precipitation data. We had the Mormon pioneers kept detailed notes on precipitation throughout the basin. So they had a lot of information about what was going on between 1870s and about 1905. And it was a period that was very similar to the 30s, 40s, and 50s. It was a drought period. In fact, it's the reason one of the reasons that the Reclamation Act was passed in 1902 is because of that dry period that began in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and a crash in mineral prices. Western senators were looking around for something that could, stabilize their economy, and they turned to reclamation, to the Reclamation Act, and they did it because of a drought, dry conditions on the Colorado River. Those were pretty well known. So what LaRue and Stabler and others basically did was try to reconstruct the flow of the river based on stage readings, the great levels of the Salt Lake, which other scientists have been doing for a long time, and it's fairly reliable. Herman Stabler, who was a colleague of E.C. LaRue, and he was actually the chief of the land classification branch of the USGS. He was one of the top folks there. He estimated the natural flow at Lee Ferry at about 14.2. Now, he didn't really look at Lee Ferry. He looked at Laguna and changed it to Hoover Dam. The focus is what's the inflow to Hoover Dam. Lee Ferry wasn't quite as important really until post-1922, really more others would even say until post-1940s. The inflow to Lake Powell, not as big. The inflow to Hoover was really a big deal because they were building Hoover Dam. So Stabler figured that the long-term flow was about 14.3. LaRue, from using his techniques that looked at the inflow or the levels at the Great Salt Lake, there was a gauge put in at the Salt Lake to measure the elevation to very precisely in 1875. He actually tried to resurrect the river flows back to 1851 using the memories of some pioneers. Those memories weren't that great, but the gauge was. So when you look at his 1875 to 1922 period of record, which was, it was about 15 million acre feet of natural flow. He didn't use the word natural flow at the time. He used, he corrected the flows to a common 1922 level of development. It's easy for us to reconstruct those, and that's what we've done. So 15 million acre feet. So by mid-1920s, we had pretty much a modern view of the Colorado River in terms of what the flow is. Let's forget about climate change impacts since 2000 for the moment. The problem was that information was largely disregarded because after the compact was negotiated, the next step was ratification. And this next one shows basically here's what Reclamation Service, Arthur Powell Davis was using, 18 million. Colorado's Delph Carpenter was using 17.5. Carpenter was a really, I've gotten a great deal of respect for Carpenter. He really understood the politics. Now, one of the things he didn't really understand was he was very much a state-oriented person. And the idea that the federal government would come in and build these big projects was really antithetical to him. He didn't like that idea. He thought we would be in trouble. So what Carpenter believed is the flow at Lee Ferry, the natural flow at Lee Ferry was about 17.5, and if that's what Carpenter said, then lots of the other commissioners followed what Carpenter did, and his number was very close to Reclamation's at 18. Now, by the 1920s, mid-1920s, this information was out there. And in our book, we're not that critical of Carpenter because they had a choice. In 1927, the states got together for nearly a month in Denver to talk about the future, the fact that Arizona was opposing the compact and they hadn't had it ratified. What are they going to do? They had basically two choices. They had reopened the negotiations, or they had let's proceed on a 6-state ratification process, and let's just essentially put it this way, let's run over Arizona. Let's go to Congress and just run over Arizona, and that's what they did. And what we come to the conclusion is they made the right decision. Reopening the compact by 1927, it would have been very unlikely that they would have been able to put together a new deal. Arizona's price for essentially changing the compact by 1927 was give us all a Gila, give us, basically, Arizona wanted too much. And they kind of, our kind of speculation is they understood that the water was probably not there, but given the choices of reopening negotiations or proceeding with a 6-state ratification project, the Upper Basin is probably better off taking the latter route. And I think they were right. I think that what would have happened had they the governors chosen in 1927, which was to try and correct things, would have been they would have all ended up in the Supreme Court for a decade and a half, and probably sometime after World War II, the Supreme Court would have essentially come up with some solution to the Colorado River problem that would have been much worse off. The whole basin would have been worse off. So that's kind of the quick story. I want to go through and say, many of you have seen this. This is the flows beginning in 1906. The Bureau of Reclamation puts this out. They show a 10-year running average. They show the annual flows. This is natural flows. And they show a running average to date. Beginning in 1906 really gives you a kind of a skewed information. Now remember, from about 1930 before, a lot of this is synthetic. And what we've done is we've looked at what other information was out there. What are these other reconstructions that LaRue and Stabler and others did? And you can take the record back to 1875. And if you do that, you come out with this. That shows a very different view. It shows that the river has been around 14 and a half for the last 150 years or so. And it also shows that what Stabler and LaRue concluded, that 1906 to 1930 was just a period of two things. It was abnormally wet and it was abnormally cool. It was the right conditions for good runoff. But that's not something that we discovered in 50 years later. That's something we knew really by 1930. And that's sort of the difference in the book. That's what we're hoping to do, is have people think about the messages as it applies today, and I'll get into some of those. And this is, let's forget about what I just said and just talk about what does it mean for what you've heard from Brad, what you're going to hear from Doug Kenny, from Ann Castle, from John Caron. And first, there are inequities right now between the basins. Now, there was, at early attempts, they thought, and this was Carpenter's idea, we'll split the river, upper basin, lower basin. We'd split it 50-50. That's not what happened. They apportioned 8.5 for the lower basin, 7.5 under 3A, and another $1 million under 3B. That was an apportionment just like 3A. Hoover makes that clear in his report to Congress. Carpenter makes that very clear in his report to the Colorado legislature. The lower basin's getting 8.5. We split it 7.5 and 8.5 basically because of the way the dynamics of the negotiation. It could have easily been 3A, 8.5 to the lower basin, 3B, 7.5. But they didn't do it that way. So 8.5 goes to the lower basin, 7.5 to the upper basin. The other thing that's real interesting is that many of the disputes, compact issues that have been around since the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s have never, ever been resolved. They've simply been finessed. Every time we talk about them, we say, yeah, let's not really resolve that issue. Let's put it on the table. And a good example of that is the Mexican treaty obligation that was first finessed. I would say first finessed in the 40s and 50s. It required a real finesse, a major finesse in 1970, when the 1968 Act required the Secretary to prepare a long-range operating criteria, what we call the LROC, Coordinated Operations of Lake Mead and the Upper Basin Reservoirs. Then then they had to come up with how much water are we going to release under Article 602A to the lower basin. The story that Raleigh has, and I think he's right on this because I've heard it from Felix Sparks, was the Bureau of Reclamation, primarily Secretary Hickel, decided it was going to be 823, so they formed a task force, and the purpose of the task force was to tell Secretary Hickel why it was going to be 823. That was sort of Raleigh's answer, and and I think he was right. The 823 was preordained because it's 75 divided by 10, which is 7.5, half of the Mexican treaty, which is 750,000, less a little bit that comes in from the Paria, which is 20,000 acre-feet. So we've been there since 1970. Really, they talked about delivering that 823 in 1948 during the Upper Colorado River Compact negotiations. They spent a day talking about the sizing of Lake Powell and the CRSP operations, and the engineering committee was almost unanimous in its recommendation that we use, for sizing reservoirs, not for a legal commitment, that we use 8.3 million acre-feet, 8.25 rounded off, as our assumption of what the upper basin's long-term delivery was going to be at Leaf Ferry. And this other idea is it's a non-depletion it's a non-depletion requirement, it's not a delivery requirement. If Carpenter were to come back, he'd say, you guys are crazy. I called it a guarantee, I called it a delivery requirement, every other compact commissioner did. But today, if we call it a delivery requirement, or if we talk about the Mexican treaty, I'm glad the CWCB's meeting because they might have somebody from the AG's office, and you go, the men in black wand that they wave, and it just erases your memory. Every time we talked about Mexico, we'd have somebody from the AG's office here waving the wand saying, you've got to forget everything. You will forget everything you've now talked about with Mexico, except for the fact that we're delivering 8.25. So anyway, to me, the key to moving forward in the future is going to be how much water should we plan? How much, should we be talking about a 20 million acre-foot river as they were in 1922, or an 18 million acre-foot river as they were talking about in the 40s? or a 12 or 13 million acre foot river, or maybe less. And then I think you'll get a good issue. Now, real quickly, I did say I wanted to commend Brad Udall, the story about modeling demands. I was there. The Upper Basin did fool itself because Terry Folt proposed the current system of tiers, and they provided some modeling. The modeling was based on the Upper Colorado River Commission schedule, which is provided from the states. It overstated our current uses by about 500,000 acre feet. So when Tim Henley for the Lower Basin was counting 748s, and Randy Seaholm for the Upper Basin was calling 9s, and the idea was they had to be about the same or we didn't have a deal. Well, they were about the same. Now, what's happened since is our depletions have been far less, probably 10 million acre feet less since 2007, and that means the inflow to Powell has been more. So despite the fact that we have had drier hydrology, we're seeing more 9s, and we did that because we set ourselves up by putting unrealistic high demands in this. And I was a part of that, I admit it. So anyway, good catch. So any questions? I don't want to hold you back from lunch.
But we could still entertain a question. So I'll ask one. So you're kind of gentle on how they viewed the differing numbers back then. Maybe they weren't ignored, but they were chosen not to be used, what we would call the more accurate numbers. But was there cushion, really, the fact that the Upper Basin was so underdeveloped that they could kick the can down the road?
Yeah, that was Carpenter's view. Carpenter basically believed that the Upper Basin was limited in its demand. His preferred compact is not what we got. He didn't like it. That was what he had to accept based on the negotiations. His preferred compact was one where the Lower Basin would have no impact on our water use in the Upper Basin. They would get whatever we gave them. With one caveat, he would put a limitation on trans-mountain diversions because they were wholly consumptive. And Carpenter believed that because of the mountain topography, high elevation, our limit would be about 4 to 5 million acre feet. And he was pretty much right. He got it. He got the situation we were in today pretty close to right.
Anybody else? Well, let's give Eric a round of applause. Thank you.
Thanks.